Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Aaron Nicholson. I am the Acting Director of Programming at China Institute, and it is my honor to welcome all of you this evening. For those of you who don't know us, China Institute was founded in 1926 by Chinese and American educators. At its core, our mission is to help Americans better understand China, and I can think of no better way to do that than through literature. Chinese literature can offer readers an extraordinary window into China, but for newcomers to this rich and complex world, where does one begin? And so tonight we have partnered with Paper Republic, a UK-based charity with a mission of increasing the quantity, quality, and visibility of Chinese literature in English translation to help launch their guide to contemporary Chinese literature. Tonight we'll get a chance to delve into that guide, which has been years in the making, with several of its contributors, including Dylan Levy-King and Ping Zhu. But before we welcome them, I want to turn over the floor to Eric Abrahamsen, who will introduce us to this project and then moderate the remainder of this evening's program. Eric Abrahamsen is a translator and promoter of Chinese literature in English. He is the founder of Paper Republic and an editor of Pathlight Magazine, a journal of translated Chinese fiction and poetry. He is the recipient of translation grants from PEN and the NEA, and his translations have appeared in The New Yorker, Granta, N+1, and many others. Thank you, Eric. Congratulations again on this wonderful publication, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Eric is also unable to keep his time zone straight, despite working between multiple countries my entire life. Sorry for bombing in and starting to shout in the middle of other people already talking. I thought I was going to have an extra hour to do my deep breathing exercises, but here we are. Very glad to be here. Thanks very much both to Aaron and to the China Institute for giving us this opportunity to talk about our new publication, the Guide to Contemporary Chinese Literature. So Paper Republic itself, I think we've had enough of an introduction. We're basically translator-founded, translator-run. Our grand mission is to get more people reading Chinese literature in every way we possibly can, which also involves getting more Chinese literature translated. This idea for the guide started years ago, and I think it was originally mostly focused at the publishing industry because we were talking to a bunch of publishers in English-speaking countries about what Chinese literature had on offer. And we found a lot of times if we pitched a book to them, they would just say, well, this sounds interesting, but we have no idea how to place it in context. We don't know how to sort of compare it to other books in the same category. We just don't know how this fits into the rest of it. And so we started thinking, okay, don't know how it fits into the rest of it. So what we need to do is provide information, sort of providing, giving a bird's eye view of what Chinese literature is so that people who are reading can sort of place individual authors, individual writers into a larger context. And we've added that idea around for a very long time. And finally, here it is, boom. The Guide to Contemporary Chinese Literature. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's basically comes in two parts. There's a collection of essays up front, which attack Chinese literature from a variety of different sort of thematic points of view. So our two honored guests this evening are authors of two of the essays in the front half of the guide. And that's stuff about science fiction, internet literature, women's writing, stuff like that. The second half of the guide is a voluminous directory to various Chinese writers and their books, mostly those that are available to read in English, but also some as yet untranslated. So the idea being that if you hear the name of a Chinese writer bandied about in conversation or mentioned in a book review, you say, that person sounds interesting. Or you see a book on the shelf in the bookstore and think, I wonder if I might be interested in picking that up and reading it. You could go to the guide, thumb through it, find the person, and sort of give yourself a background on who that is in a short period of time. And we're no longer aiming this thing at publishers in particular. We figured, why not aim it at anybody who might be interested in this sort of thing? So general readers who are curious about Chinese literature, book reviewers who are considering reviewing a work of Chinese translation, or feel like during the course of the translation they'd like a little more background on that. Obviously, it has academic applications, and we're hoping that the essays are interesting enough, insightful enough that you can just sort of pull it off the shelf and read it for entertainment. So that's sort of the background on the guide itself. Tonight we are joined by Dylan Levi King and Ping Zhu, who, as Aaron mentioned, and I mentioned, are contributors to the guide. Dylan's got the first essay up front in the essay section. This comes after an introduction by Xiaolu Guo. Dylan's essay is called "The Role of the Author," and it's sort of a more conceptual essay talking about how the role of the author in Chinese society has changed, perceptions and realities has changed over the past few decades. And Pingzhu's contribution is titled "Women's Writing" and is a sort of an overview of the most important female writers in China, and also kind of how women's writing has been and how it has existed as a subcategory of Chinese literature as a whole. And so, given the two of you should turn your cameras on. By the way, I think we're getting to the point where we'd like to see you. Hello there. Dylan's there as well. So Dylan's in Tokyo. Oh, so Dylan's a writer and translator based in Tokyo, and Pingzhu is a professor of Chinese literature at the University of Oklahoma. Also one of the editors of Chinese Literature Today, which is one of the major journals producing translations of Chinese short stories and essays and stuff like that. So a couple of very highly expert contributors to our discussion tonight. Sorry, I'm still catching up with myself here. So, given the subjects of these of our two contributors' essays, I thought that an interesting subject for tonight's conversation would be labels, categories, stereotypes, kind of the ways in which the Chinese literary environment, including readers, including sort of the literary establishment, has sort of drawn boxes around the possible ways to be a Chinese writer, whether that be from the point of view of politics, the point of view of gender, the point of view of subject, genre too. There's a lot of interesting ways that writers get categorized. So sort of the nature of those categories, and then also how Chinese writers are pushing back against them, or owning those categories, or transcending them, or moving beyond them. So that is enough for me. I think that given the less obvious nature of Dylan's essay, I wanted to start by sort of asking him to tell us a little bit about the various roles of the Chinese writer that he puts together for this essay, who they are, what they are. Just give us a little introduction to what he's talking about in that essay, and then we'll move to Pingzhu from there. Does that sound all right?
Sounds all right with me.
Cool.
So basically what I try to argue is that the role of the Chinese author is so important because they hold on to philosophical and cultural and political territory that Western writers have long ago abandoned. They are considered very important people whose work can shift a nation. I looked at a couple archetypes of the Chinese writer, and these are some big figureheads of Chinese literature that a lot of people have followed along their path. I start with Lu Xun. He's considered, the person who modern Chinese literature starts with. He's the guy who says, we don't need to write in classical Chinese anymore. We can write in the language of the people. He's not only a poet and a writer, short story writer, and a novelist and an essayist, but he's also a great democratizer of the language. And his role is being sort of located at the start of modern Chinese literature. Of course, there's many other people who come out in that sort of new culture movement and the May 4th movement. Many other names, but Lu Xun sort of reigns supreme above them. And his influence on Chinese literature, it's impossible to overstate. Basically, everybody who comes after him, writing in the Chinese language, even in Taiwan and overseas, comes from Lu Xun. If you're writing in the language of the vernacular, you're writing for the people, you're writing after Lu Xun. And The second archetype I looked at is somebody who's quite a bit different, who's Eileen Chang, Zhang Ailing. She is somebody who goes another direction from Lu Xun. She's also writing in the vernacular, of course, and she's writing after Lu Xun and those new culture movement people. But she is a writer of social life and of aesthetic beauty. And in a way, she becomes sort of a foil to Lu Xun over the years, at least in the minds of some writers. Lu Xun is the person who's engaged with the people and engaged in democratizing the language, whereas and reading him is sort of an important political act, and writing after him is an important political act, whereas reading Eileen Chang is an aesthetic and emotional pleasure. You know, writing after Eileen Chang is you're writing aesthetic beauty and writing about the world of society. There's a very interesting sort of gender divide here as well. Boys like Lu Xun and girls like Eileen Chang in general. Not that's not always true, but that's sort of a split in Chinese literature. And then one of the other archetypes I took is somebody who probably very few people have read since the 1970s, he was one of the few writers to continue publishing deep into the Cultural Revolution. Basically, in the Cultural Revolution, there was not a lot of new writing being published. There were a lot of books being published. There wasn't a stop of the presses, but there was a very select group of writers who could continue to make new work. And Hao Ran is one of those guys. And he sort of represents a new Maoist archetype of the writer. So he's not only a writer, he's not only an essayist, but he's also a theorist. So he's coming up with new theories of how we should write things. There's the image that China is closely influenced by Soviet literary theory, which is true to some extent. But of course, there was a great Sino-Soviet split, and that Sino-Soviet split even affected literature. So Chinese authors had to come up with new theories that were not Soviet. So this isn't influenced by Soviet realism, but in China, they've got a whole new world of Maoist and Cultural Revolution literary theory, like revolutionary romanticism and Jiang Qing's idea of the three prominences, all kinds of things that are no longer relevant to writing today. But that sort of model of a writer as a writer and as a theorist and as well as a bureaucrat. So Hao Ran is one of those guys who's coming into his own at a time when in Maoist China they're building a literary bureaucracy. So not only are you need to be a writer, but you need to be in a writers' union and do sort of bureaucratic work in the literary world. So those are writers like everybody knows Lu Xun, everybody knows Eileen Chang, but those writers of the 1960s and 1970s who are really underread now, the world they created is still functioning. There are still writers who are bureaucrats. Really, all if you're talking about Jia Pinghua or Mo Yan, those guys are still very much in the mold of those Cultural Revolution guys like Hao Ran, in that they have to be writers, but they also need to be bureaucrats. And one person who sort of breaks from that is another one of the archetypes, who is Wang Shuo. He's the great hooligan Beijing writer. He's one of the first sort of cultural entrepreneurs. When marketization comes to the country, marketization also comes to literature. And he wants to write. He doesn't necessarily want to be a bureaucrat. He doesn't necessarily want to be a theorist. He doesn't necessarily want to be a great democratizer of the language. So he presents sort of a fourth archetype, this sort of celebrity writer. He's one of the first writers in China you would call a celebrity writer. There were writers that sold a ton of books before, but he's one of the first people who sells his image, who gets on TV and says dirty words and writes essays in magazines talking about suggesting that he's taken drugs and that sort of thing. So he becomes sort of a modern archetype. And those four writers, to some extent, you can categorize almost everybody who comes after them in some way as following in their footsteps, as following in their trails. So those are the people who you can sort of understand everybody who comes after. There's many people who don't fit in. You know, there's one person I said is Zhang Chengzhi. He's a class of 1966 Red Guard. He's the first Red Guard. He becomes a writer in the 1970s. He's the first writer to become to leave his work unit, to leave his writer's work unit and go independent by himself. And he becomes he's a dyed-in-the-wool leftist. He goes to Japan. He becomes an international Islamist. You know, it's kind of hard to fit him into anything, but he personally identifies closely with Lu Xun. Or you could take an experimental writer like Can Xue. She doesn't really fit into any of these things, but you can use somebody like Eileen Chang, who's writing that sort of for aesthetic and literary enjoyment and pushing the boundaries. You can sort of use her to understand Can Xue. So this is not perfect. It's just sort of a heuristic to understand incompletely sort of what the role of the author is, what an author is in China. And you can see it's quite different from Western countries. This sort of heuristic will not help you to understand modern American literature or modern Japanese literature. It is something somewhat essentially Chinese.
Cool, thank you. So I mean, this gets at one of the sort of the considerations of the guide, which was that, you know, from our point of view, so many people had so little understanding of Chinese literature, they didn't even have generalizations that they could fall back on. They didn't even have the stereotypes. And so in some ways, something like the guide, you almost need to set up the stereotypes before you can learn to break them or before you can see how individuals don't fit. Because when you're starting from kind of zero, you're like, well, I wouldn't even know, you know, you wouldn't even be able to guess, you wouldn't even be able to do a caricature of a Chinese writer. And so it's kind of one of the little ironies or the little self-contradictions of the guide is that we're sort of like, you know, this is how it is, here's the generalizations, here's the broad strokes, but then please, you know, please, as soon as possible, get past that stuff. And that we hope that people, by reading the books that we talk about in the guide, will see the places where the guide has kind of done some broad stroke stuff. So I think Dylan's essay is really valuable just to give sort of people a point of view what's out there. Now, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Pingzhu had some things to say about like the gendered Lu Xun versus Zhang Ailing kind of male kind of important political writing versus, you know, the female like aesthetic emotional writing. So I know that Pingzhu, early in your essay, you talk about a group of Chinese female writers who are sort of adopting their own take on history, on historicizing fiction, on talking about Chinese history within a fictional context, which I imagine is fairly different from sort of the male writers that have come before them and are going on around them. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that dichotomy.
Thank you. Thank you. First, I want to thank Aaron from China Institute and Eric for organizing and hosting this event. And Eric, thank you for having me as a part of this exciting project. This book, right? The Paper Republic Guide to Contemporary Chinese Literature. Yes. My title, the piece for my title in this book is called Women's Writing, and it's a shorthand for the full title, which is Contemporary Chinese Women's Writing, which was given to me as an assignment in 2020, I believe, by Yvette Zhu from Paper Republic. I will answer Eric's question very soon, but I want to first say a disclaimer that women's writing is a problematic term in my opinion. It does not represent any genre or any stereotype. Actually, women's writing is nothing more than the writings produced by female writers. That's what it means. And I know that in the Western world, there's especially in Western feminism, there is this women's writing by the French feminist Ellen Ciceur. It's called a critique féminine, right? So women's writing, but it is totally different idea from the women's writing I'm discussing today, because critique féminine means a kind of other women using the other kind of language to break through the logocentric linguistic prison of the male-dominated world and to present their jouissance or their feminine sexual pleasure. But this is not the Chinese women's writing I was writing about in this short piece of essay. This is more like a mission impossible to write about Chinese women's writing in I think it was given to me 1,000 words and I expanded to 1,500 words. But okay, so to answer Eric's question about how female writers keep breaking the stereotypes through their historical novels or historical writing. You know that Chinese writers, they like to write history. First of all, like historical writing is regarded as important writing that every major writer has to do in order to win something, in order to win a prize, right? If you don't write about history, then you're not regarded as a serious writer. So ever since the 1980s, actually the late 1970s, women writers in China started to write about history too. And of course, their writing of history would be somewhat different from the previous historical writing, which centers around a grand historical narrative, right? Linear progress of history, and also the previous historical narratives. I'm generalizing again. In those historical narratives, female characters would be more or less represented as powerless or marginalized figures. So ever since the 1980s, we see some female writers such as Zhang Jie and Wang Anyi. They started to write history from the feminine perspective. So these writers actually, they kept breaking the stereotypical impressions of women's literature. For example, stereotypically, women's writers were regarded as only capable of writing the domestic space or the interiority, right? The personal experience. This was a pretty sexist view, because this kind of view stems from the impression that women were only confined in the domestic space. They do not have enough social participation, right? So they can only write about the private. But Zhang Jie, for example, she wrote about the stories in the factory, in the Chinese factory, and Wang Anyi was writing about female characters joining the social work during and after the socialist period. So their writings were not necessarily emotive centered, although they do represent the female's inferiority, but they also depict the grand social landscape as well as the male writers. So that's one thing to notice. And also the heterosexual institution is one thing that female writers challenge in their writing, because the heterosexual institution was taken for granted in male writers' works, right? As if a woman writer should always seek love. Love is her destination. However, in Chinese women's writers' works, we see that this heterosexual institution or heterosexual relationship was continuously challenged, because the males could not provide the fulfillment to the females. The males were oftentimes depicted as disappointing, coward, lack of imagination, lack of aesthetic taste, etc. Right? So we see a stream of such kind of challenge of a heterosexual institution in works by, ever since the modern period, such as Feng Yuanjun, Zhang Ailing, Ding Ling, and later on Zhang Jie, Wang Anyi. They wrote works that challenges the mandatory heterosexual institution. And then another thing is also, I think, important theme in in contemporary Chinese women writers' works, which is the double bind of the modern womanhood and the sexual modern womanhood via sexual liberation, and also their social status or personhood, 人格. So it seems to be very hard for a woman to be both liberated and respected, because the social expectation is contradictory. As a liberated woman, you have to seek your sexual freedom, right? Then as a respected woman, you have to stay away from the sexual pleasure. So this kind of double bond triggered a lot of philosophical musings in women writers' works. And also, there's one more thing to notice is Chinese male writers, they created the term of women's writing in 1910s and the 1920s, around that period. The male writers, they created women's writing in order to pursue women's liberation, or in order to give women's liberation to women. However, the women's writing at that time was reduced to a kind of emotive and restrained and private kind of elegant kind of writing. And it was regarded as autobiographical, mainly, even, as if women can only write about their own personal stories. And women writers again and again in the contemporary period actually challenged this view. Women obviously can write more than what they directly experience, right? We see in Wang Yi or in Tan Xu or in Zhang Jie, we see a lot of topics can turn into wonderful stories in their pen. So it is just a stereotype they broke again, like women can only write about their own life stories. So eventually, I think the ultimate goal for women's writing is to show that women can write like men. There's no need to have a term such as women's writing, just like we don't have a term for men's writing, right? So I think that's the ultimate goal. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's great. That's exactly what I was interested in hearing you talk about. Something I heard years ago that stuck with me was a description of Bi Feiyu, a male writer, a description of Bi Feiyu as like the most feminine of Chinese male writers, or something like that. He was the most womanly among Chinese male writers. I think for two reasons. One, that he wrote about female characters who weren't just cardboard cutouts. They were like, you know, the protagonists of his stories were women. So that was like, well, that was already like, whoa, a Chinese writer who has, you know, a main character as a woman. And also because there was something about his writing that had this sort of what was considered, you know, a feminine approach, where if the interiority, domestic relationships, you know, the emotional states of the characters, rather than the characters being like, you know, pawns on the historical chessboard, kind of, they're actually up close people. And I just thought it was so weird that these categories are so rigid that they had to go all the way around and say, okay, Bi Feiyu, he's like a woman writer, but he's a man, and isn't that amazing? And he's like this sort of, you know, on display kind of. And I could tell it always sort of bothered him a little bit, but then at the same time, any writer wants to be the most something, you know, in his country and in her country. So I think he was sort of proud of it, but also I thought he thought it was pretty weird. That also always just seemed like such an odd illustration of like these boxes that the writers are put into gender-wise. Pingju, do you think that female Chinese writers are explicitly rebelling against this very sort of duty-based writerly role that Dylan's describing, kind of like in terms of the, you know, the socialist realist writing, that kind of thing, like where the idea of the writer having a responsibility to somehow reflect their society, to somehow, you know, reflect the historical reality of their people. Do you think that there's a conscious pushing back against that among female writers, or is it more just like they're just trying to do their own thing?
Yeah, since the female writer is not a homogeneous group, right?
Sure.
So of course, some of them would still try to do the the social, like literature for life or literature for society kind of thing, because it's a long tradition in China. It's called a 文以载道, right? Literature is used to carry the Dao, the way. During the 1920s, there was this debate about literature for life or literature for art, and eventually literature for life won the debate, right? So the socialist period was all about how literature and the material life should interact with each other and enrich each other. And some of the female writers I studied, they grew up during the socialist period. So they were basically nurtured by this tradition, this socialist tradition or literature for life tradition. And even during the post-socialist period, they were still trying to use literature to push the ideal society or the ideal social idea, the social ideal, such as Wang Anyi, for example. She was still using her literature to show you what an ideal society should be. So she's still engaging with the social reality in the process of literary production. However, some other writers, for example, Tan Xue, I don't think she cares about social reality, because for her, social reality and the spiritual reality are two different things, right? And she wanted to pursue the pure spiritual reality through her wild imagination. She calls this a kind of performance. She does the performance of her imagination every day. And that's why her stories are not so much easily translated into social reality. Tan Xue is such a unique character, writer. So she was basically dumbfounding all the Chinese critics, because they are speechless in front of her works. They don't know how to interpret her work, because they were used to the utilitarian kind of literature interpretation, which does not work for Tan Xue. So, and I think the younger generation in general would more likely to be the writing for oneself or writing for art kind of type. And the older generation would, in general, there are always exceptions. Older generation would be more entrenched in the literature for society kind of type.
Dylan, is that something that you would agree with, sort of, as your historical survey of these archetypes? Does it, on the literature for life versus literature for art continuum, is that something that you see as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of the interesting thing in China is the power of the official feminist movement and feminist discourse. Starting in the 1920s, that a lot of women writers are closely influenced by. I've always been interested in. This is a book that's sort of much maligned and a lot of people don't take seriously, but Wei Hui's Shanghai Baby, I think, is just an incredible kind of revolutionary statement by a writer. I know everybody hates this book. I know its translator into English quite dislikes it, but it was a book written by a woman about her experiences in Shanghai, her erotic and adventures, her life, and it was a book that I think deserves more respect and usually is quite often not brought up in these discussions of important women's writing. But I think it's worth a look at something that sort of challenges a lot of stereotypes of this time.
Can I
yeah, of course, please.
Because I actually read Dylan writing about Shanghai Baby in your piece, and I'd like to address this question. I do Chinese feminism, right? I think the reason why Shanghai Baby was not highly praised by critics was because it shows the commodification of women, right? And actually, there's this reading habit. In Chinese, the reading, the readers would not expect, they're not used to neoliberal success stories of one individual woman, right? But such kind of stories actually sell well in the Western book market. So there's a big difference. I do agree with Dylan, though. There's something revolutionary about taking over the expression of sexuality from male writers, because before Wei Hui and Mian Mian, male writers were producing a lot of stories with abundant sexual depictions, but not female writers, right? So they basically took it over and made it a female writing weapon, right? So that's revolutionary. But there's something also like worth warning, which is we shouldn't, like, I'm a feminist, so we shouldn't treat the female body as a commodity in the market, whether I think there's also a racial element playing in the reading the story. So that's why the story is not regarded highly, mainly because it's a neoliberal story of commodification. Yeah.
I think there's also something different about the way Western readers, there is that racial element. There's a horrible film made out of this movie starring the actress Bai Ling, and it's sort of this softcore pornography about the sexual hunger of Chinese women. It's incredibly offensive, but I think there's sort of the way it's been read in the West is sort of more as a critique of that sort of the woman as neoliberal subject, and that's a way that it's not often read in Chinese. I think there's sort of a difference in how we read them.
I think it was just popular outside of China too, because it was so surprising. A lot of people at that time still their minds were still stuck in the Cultural Revolution, in terms of like perceptions of Chinese society, and then suddenly you have this, you're like, whoa, they have sex, drugs, and rock and roll too. And I think that sort of spurred a wave of interest in similar books that kind of died out after a while. But you have to think that changed the playing field, changed the arena for writers within China a little bit. I mean, Pingjun, you mentioned Sheng Keyi and her like Northern Girls in your essay as well. And I've certainly always seen that book as like I think of it as a fairly healthy, whatever that means, morally healthy depiction of like an individual female character owning her own sexuality, and there's a lot of weird things that happen in the book, but like very fundamentally it seemed to me she is neither an object nor a commodity, and she is in some sense in control of her own physicality. Would you agree with that?
I agree, she's in control of her own sexuality, but in Sheng Keyi's works, I feel like she's also representing those lower class women as a group instead of as individuals. So her protagonists are representative of a social group, which is, those migrant workers or female workers working in factories in South China, right? So I feel like that's actually very precious, because especially in recent decades, you don't see a lot of lower class depictions in cultural products on Chinese TV. It's always middle class. And so reading Sheng Keyi's works, you see that actually the robust or resilient kind of existence of women in the lower social stratum, and they're thriving, right, in their own way. They're resisting, they're thriving in a way. So that kind of vitality, that kind of empowered women figures is something I really like. And that also connects to a related group I mentioned in the short piece, which is the female migrant workers mainly, but migrant workers in general, which based in Pichun, Beijing. Pichun is a suburban village in Beijing. So they are using literature as a means to express their own existence, to represent their own existence, because literature culture was regarded as part of the proletarian revolution, right? Like the working class people should possess culture. They shouldn't just produce culture and make culture a commodity for the middle class. They should possess and enjoy the culture they produce. And this thing was kind of lost in the post-socialist period. But now in works by Sheng Keyi and the migrant workers in Pichun, we're seeing the trend coming back. So they are enjoying the culture they produce.
This is, I think, one of the most interesting things about contemporary Chinese literature is that it is quite radical to write 底层文学, to write from the lower class writing. And that kind of writing is quite rarely translated. There's a great book by Cao Zhenglu called Wen Cangmang, which is about he writes about migrant workers at a Taiwanese factory, or Fang Yiluo's I Am a Floating Flower, or Feng Youwei's Mudfish, Sheng Ke Yi. That writing is we rarely see it in translation, and it kind of quite rarely makes like the Maoduen Prize or anything like that. And that migrant worker literature is very important. It's sort of invisible to us reading literature in translation.
This reminds me a lot about an event we did a couple of weeks ago about Shuang Tao's new book out in translation called Rouge Street. So Shuang Tao is from Shenyang in northeastern China, and this Rouge Street is a collection of, I don't know, interlinked stories or something like that. Three novellas that are about this place that he grew up in, Shenyang, very sort of lower class, working class, northeastern China, the Rust Belt of China, everything falling apart. People's livelihoods falling apart. There's no social nets or anything like that. And it struck me because it's, on the one hand, it's very sort of traditional Chinese literature in the sense that he's chosen like a group of people and their historical economic plight and everything that's happening to them. And he's writing about them sort of in a way that almost seems aimed at giving you an overview of these people, in much the same way that maybe Sheng Ke Yi, you could say she's writing about migrant workers or something. But his approach to writing struck me as totally different, because all of the individuals, all of the characters in the story are incredibly alive. They're all three-dimensional characters with their own points of view, their own subjectivity, their own, they're making decisions about their lives, their own quirks. They're weird people. And so it felt very different from other Chinese literature I've read, where I kind of got the sense that, the author is just using characters as puppets, kind of like, and then this is one type of person in this situation. This is another type of person. And you don't feel like these are real living characters. Sometimes you feel like they're tools for explaining a chunk of Chinese history. And this Rouge Street, I was really amazed. Like, the characters don't know that they're caught in this like deterministic historical situation. They don't care. Each one of them has their own like bizarre sort of ideas that they're going after. And there's a real imaginative space in there where you're reading it and you don't feel like you're being given a history lesson, which was nice. And that kind of just reminded me of, Canxue, Pingzhu just described her as, performing imagination. And I always feel, sort of personally, selfishly, as a reader and a translator, I wanted Chinese writers to do more of that. I always wanted sort of a little more of that. And Canxue is like an extreme example of that kind of writing, where really it's just springing out of her head in a way. But I could even feel in Shuang Tao's in Rouge Street, I could feel a little bit of that, in that it was enlivened by this sense of imagination that belonged to him alone, and that was just, I don't know, very helpful. I really enjoyed reading those stories. How much, I wanted to ask both of you, how much do you, for any writer in any country, in any situation, there's a tension between writing for yourself versus writing for an audience. Writing for an audience can mean writing for your readers, but it can also mean writing for the literary establishment that you're a part of. Everyone's thinking, how am I going to get the prize? How am I going to get the review? And I was just curious what you guys saw as the realities right now. Well, the past few years are maybe a little bit different, but over the past couple of decades, do you feel like Chinese writers have more freedom to operate, not just in terms of like censorship and publication and stuff like that, but almost psychologically? Do they have more room, sort of are they less bound by the expectations of their readers and the literary establishment that they find themselves in? Either of you.
So I'll go first. Oh, okay.
Sure.
Yeah. First, let me first introduce the institution of the Chinese writers. It helps to answer the question. Chinese writers, they joined this Chinese Writers Association. It's called a 作协. There are national level 作协 and the provincial level 作协. When they become members, after they publish a certain number of works, they will be qualified to become a member. When they become member, they get salary. So that's actually one important factor, because once they get salary, they do not have to cater too much to the market. They are not writing in order to feed themselves, right? So market becomes less important for these writers in the establishment, in the institution. And also, I think when I met Wang Anyi a few years ago, she came to Norman to receive the Newman Prize. She also said she believes great literature can only be born in, not can only, but she believes that like aristocracy, patronage can produce great literary works, because she does not believe in the market of being a factor of great literary works. So in that sense, we can understand why many established Chinese writers, they do not care too much about readers. Of course, if their works sell well, they will be happy, but what's more important is for them to pursue their own literary ideals, right? For example, Tan Xue's works did not sell well at all in China, but she kept writing, and she was very confident in her own literary talent. And of course, she was more, actually, her works were more successful in the international market than in the domestic market. But it doesn't prevent her from pursuing her literary ideals or literary experiments ever since the 80s. A lot of writers, they were doing the avant-gardist literature in China in the 80s. And a lot of them later, in order to become more important writers, shifted to realistic writing, giving up the avant-gardist experiment, but Tan Xue did not. So this is another example that many Chinese writers, many famous Chinese writers, they do not care about the market or the reader, or they don't have an expected reader, or their reader actually existing the future or existing the foreign market, but not necessarily in China, in their own place, in their own motherland. But it's a little bit different for internet writing or the young writers, because these writers, they do write in order to, they don't have salary from the Writers Association, so they do have to cater to the market in order to get their monthly income. So I think this is a total different story. But for the established writers, they have more pride. They can have their autonomous in writing.
But do you think that the Writers Association itself then forms another kind of audience that they have to be aware of?
Yeah, the elitist audience, right? There's an elitist circle of writers and critics, literary critics. They form their own niche, and these people do have to consider each other's view. They have to network. They have to, promote each other's works. That's very different from the market.
Yeah. Do you know Tan Xue is not part of the Writers Association, is she?
She is,
but
she never goes to the meetings. She's a hermit, even though she is listed as she gets salary too from the Writers Association.
Interesting. And I know that like Shen Kui is also a member of, I can't remember which provincial Writers Association as well. And she said that she drew a salary and no one ever even asked her what she was doing. So sometimes you think like Writers Association, tool of censorship, government control. And then sometimes it's like, man, they're not. Nobody's even picking up the phone and asking if you're still writing. Dylan, have you noticed anything about this?
Yeah, I mean, the lack of there is marketization to some extent that acts as a force, but that's really what keeps Chinese literature quite interesting. That's one reason why it's one of the great gulfs between the West and Chinese writers is that they exist in such a different ecosystem. A writer who's reached a certain level can basically write whatever the heck they want, within reason. There's nobody's going to be, if Jia Pinghua brings out a new book, within reason, nobody's going to touch it. Not even an editor is going to go through it. There are as you said, those young writers like Shuang Suitao, he is still, that literary bureaucracy still functions, even though he's sort of made his name on Douban and online. He's still part of the literary bureaucracy in a way that really helps him. Those journals like Harvest or October, 人民文学, those still have an impact that nobody in America reads maybe Granta, but except for that, it's really doesn't function. So that lack of the market force is quite an interesting factor in Chinese literature.
There's a Chinese universities, only a few of them have sort of creative writing MFAs the way that we would sort of understand that in the US and the UK or something. But there is something called the Luxun Literary Academy in Beijing, which is like this, boot camp for writers or something. And it's really a career launcher. And I think Shuang Suitao went through that and got pretty much everybody. And so even if they're not part of the Writers Association, it's like writers sort of get tapped to attend the academy. And who knows? I think it's mostly a networking thing. I think they get lectures by famous writers and all, and I'm sure that's useful, but I think it's mostly a networking thing. But it's interesting to hear, sort of look at comparisons with the US, and everyone's like, if you're going to make it as a writer in the US, you have to move to Brooklyn, right? And sort of, I tell people outside of China, well, if you're a writer in China and you're going to make it, you got to move to Beijing. And they're like, oh yeah, it's just like Brooklyn in the US. I'm like, yeah, it's nice, it's like similar, but not, not quite to the same degree.
It's interesting how much the Iowa program shaped Chinese literature as well. The insane number, not insane, but the great number of writers who went to the Iowa Writers Program in the 80s and up to present and went back. Sort of an interesting thing.
And it's interesting talking to Chinese writers, many of whom have this idea that if they have this idea that sort of the literary world outside of being China is being untainted by politics. The ones who are sort of a little dissatisfied with how things are going inside China. There's sometimes a kind of a naive point of view of like, in the US you can, freedom of speech, you can write everything, it's all a meritocracy. And if I can only get published in the US, these books will be read on their merits. And I think it's sort of surprising the other way too, to say, oh no, actually, I still want to emphasize there's a great difference in degree, but no, actually, there's a lot of sort of small p politics in the US literary world as well. Somebody put a question in the QA, which might be interesting to talk about at this point, about Manny Ramos is asking about Hong Ying's novel K, about the legal thing that came up around that. But I think it's also interesting to just talk about an author like Hong Ying, who seems to be straddling kind of the inside China, outside China line, and I think that she grew up, her early fiction is very much about China, and then sort of more and more international as she progressed through her career. And now it's sort of hard to, sometimes it seems like the membrane, between the Chinese literary world and sort of international literature, whatever that is so thick, you're either on one side or the other. And I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts about what that has done for the careers of Chinese writers who have either moved abroad or started publishing mostly abroad. I know like Guo Xiaolu lives abroad and mostly publishes abroad. Hong Ying does as well. There's Hajin, of course, is a big example. How do you think that complicates the situation?
So Hong Ying's K was based on the real story between Ling Shuhua and her lover, right?
Right.
I don't know about the legal issue. I heard that it was sued by the Ling Shuhua's family offspring. Later.
Defamation or something like that. I mean, I think it was just sort of a not a very nice portrait of their family member. That was their argument.
Yeah, I didn't do a close study of this story, but I did mention a few diasporic Chinese female writers who was writing about those similar kinds, not similar, Hong Ying, and also, for example, An Qiming, who wrote Red Azalea, and Zhong Zhang, who wrote Wild Swamps, right? So these are three representative figures writing diasporic Chinese women writers. I feel like in order to be well received in the international market, in the market outside of China, they do have to reproduce some kind of stereotypes, cross-cultural stereotypes, and those stereotypes sometimes include victimhood, women as victims, right? Sometimes include hypersexualized female characters. So these are or sometimes include empowered female who achieved a neoliberal kind of success. So these kind of stories are easily received by the Western market or the foreign market, but not necessarily in China. I feel like An Qiming or Zhong Zhang or Hong Ying, their success can kind of demonstrate those stereotypes in a way. Of course, I'm not saying their works have no value. I think their works have a lot of merits actually, but still, you can kind of identify the stereotypes still existing in the cross-cultural reading and the cross-cultural literary production. I don't know if they did this consciously. In China, like the women writers also wrote about their own family history or own personal history, but they would include more social historical details and made the story more maybe nuanced instead of using a lucid, simplified historical narrative. But that might be a case for the diasporic writers. They have to kind of reduce their narrative into a more lucid flow narrative in order for the transnational audience to grasp it. So yeah, I can't give you a very satisfactory answer because these are not my subject of study.
Just curious.
Yeah,
Dylan,
these books tend to be, there's a great divide. There's diasporic writers that write in Chinese. Xue Yiwei, who wrote this book called The Shenzheners. He's based in Montreal. It's a brilliant book, and obviously not intended to ever be read by. It's been translated now by Daryl Stirk, but not written for a Western audience. Whereas if you take something like Li Jiazhang's Socialism is Good, or there's very few good examples of that sort of writing. Xiao Luguo is one example of somebody who does it very well. A concise Chinese English dictionary for lovers is just a brilliant, brilliant novel. She's one of the few that does it very well. But there's a lot of very bad examples that play up to a lot of very ugly stereotypes, and but more power to them. Good for them. Yeah.
Interesting.
Talking about Xue Yiwei, Chinese Literature Today just published a big special section on his works, and there are some translations and also interview. I put a link in the chat. I don't know if everyone can see it. You can download and read the content for free. I think by the end of April, so we have 4 days. Yeah, we are running a promotion period in April, but today is already 27th. So. Yeah, Xue Yiwei is a very unique maverick writer, a diasporic maverick writer.
He's very good.
So I am returning to our stage because unfortunately we are out of time. I could certainly listen to you guys go on for hours. But I thought I would actually take us out of this discussion with one final question, a bit of a lighter end to the evening, which is just ask all three of you, what is on your nightstand? What are you reading right now, or what are you excited to read in the coming weeks? It can be something, anything Chinese literature and translation of the last couple of years that you would recommend to our audience. And I will start off by saying that I am finally getting around to finishing Liu Cixin's wonderful 3-body trilogy. Finally making my way through the second installment in that series, and I think next on my nightstand is The Wedding Party. Translated by the wonderful Jeremy Tiang, who I think translated, the recent Rouge Street that Eric mentioned a few minutes ago.
So anybody else want to go?
Yeah, I did not prep you guys for this. So any thoughts?
Well, one would hope that we're all reading books of some sort. So as long as we're not shy.
I just read and wrote a review of Rouge Street. Shuang Sui Tao is I think one of the most exciting writers, and this book is a rare treat to read something that's new. You know, quite often we're getting Chinese writers in translation who wrote their first novel before most of us were born. They're still wonderful. We should all be still reading Jia Pinghua. I love Jia Pinghua, Wang Anyi. But sometimes it's exciting to hear from what's happening on the cutting edge. Shuang Xie Tao is also not exactly a young man. He's nearing 40, but he's still a young Chinese writer. Dongbei, the northeast of China, is having sort of a moment where you have Shuang Sui Tao and Ban Yu, who are two very exciting writers. These are writers who were influenced by that 1970s, 1980s generation. They're as well influenced by all those great 19th century realists, and also by American postmodernists, Japanese literature. Shuang Sui Tao has the amazing ability to write these gritty, you can just smell the urine and cabbage steaming off the page. And he's also an amazing stylist, where he can do these next level narrative tricks that don't seem annoying. I really hate narrative tricks. I like socialist realist literature. I want to read Great Changes in a Mountain Village. I want to read Zhou Libo, but he does it very well. He's cutting edge, modern, amazing. Jeremy Tiang's translation is very good. So I really recommend everybody pick that up.
Recently I'm reading for my research, so I read a lot of works produced in the 50s and the 60s. I don't think I should recommend because they're not even available in English, but I recommend this book, Fu Ping, written by Wang Yi. It's a novella written by Wang Yi and translated by Howard Goldblatt. I actually wrote an essay on this novella, and I heard another collection of Wang Yi's novellas might be come out from Cornell University soon. I knew that it was being submitted a few months ago, so I hope it's coming out. There's a story, it's called I Love Bill, and I think it's an important story that can be read alongside with stories such as Shanghai Baby or Kay, my English lover. So the comparison would be very interesting.
For myself, after decades of living abroad and having an exciting international life, I moved back to Seattle, where I'm from, and I'm trying to be like as parochial and local and uninteresting as possible. So I'm reading lots of sort of local nature writing, including Across the Olympic Mountains, which is about a group of total idiots who tried to cross the Olympic Mountains in 1889 in the dead of winter with no real gear except for these manly-looking guns, and almost died. So that's what I'm reading.
Well, thank you all three of you for sharing, and thank you for sharing your time with us this evening. Thank you to our audience for sticking with us until the very end. You are in good hands with Paper Republic. It's a wonderful source, for anything related to Chinese literature in translation. So I certainly encourage all of you to pick up Paper Republic's Guide to Contemporary Chinese Literature. You can visit them. I believe it's paper-republic.org. It's a wonderful resource. I use it, to learn about, new happenings in the world of Chinese literature in translation. And of course, visit us as well. We are China Institute, chinainstitute.org. We are a home for all things related to China. And please do become members. Your membership helps support wonderful programming like this one. And we hope to get all three of you, Eric, Ping, and Dylan, thank you so much again, and hope to have you back to our stage, either virtually or in person very soon.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dylan and Pingju.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.